The aircraft carrier was the ship that was going to win the war, and the Hornet was the newest and proudest of them. At least, that was the promise she was launched on, and there was truth in it. By the time she was commissioned in October of 1941, a matter of weeks before Pearl Harbor, it was becoming clear to the men who thought about such things that the future of naval warfare belonged not to the battleship, but to the carrier, the ship that could strike an enemy hundreds of miles away with her aircraft before he ever came within sight. The Hornet was the third and last of the Yorktown class, the finest carriers America had, more than 800 feet of flight deck, 90 aircraft, better than 30 knots. And she was brand new, gleaming, the cutting edge of the fleet. The men who reported aboard her were joining the modern Navy, the Navy of the future, the glamorous arm where the Aviators were kings and the ship itself was a marvel of engineering. On paper, she was the most advanced kind of warship in the world, and to serve on her was to be at the very front of where the Navy was going. The reality was a brand new ship with a green crew, thrown into the most violent year of the Pacific War, with no time to learn her trade, and she was a floating tank of gasoline and high explosive that could be turned into an inferno in a matter of minutes. She was commissioned on the 20th of October, 1941. She was sunk on the 27th of October, 1942. That is just over 1 year, and into that single year she packed the Doolittle Raid, the Battle of Midway, and the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, and at the end of it, she was overwhelmed and destroyed. The last American fleet carrier ever lost to enemy action. When she died at Santa Cruz, around 140 of her men died with her. And at Midway, 5 months earlier, her torpedo squadron flew off her deck to attack the Japanese fleet. 30 men and 15 aircraft, and one of them came back. The whole squadron in a single morning, and then, 5 months later, the ship herself. This is the story of what it was to live and serve aboard her in that one furious year, the day-to-day of it. The heat and the crowding, and the gasoline, and the fear, and why the men who were there would tell you that being on the Hornet was hell. Start with the fact that governed everything. She was new, and so was almost everyone on her. A warship is not really ready the day she is commissioned. She is a complicated machine full of new equipment, operated by a crew who have mostly never worked together, and turning that into a fighting ship takes time. A shakedown cruise and then months of drills and exercises, working up the crew until every man knows his job, and every team runs smoothly, and the whole vast organism functions as one. The Hornet never really got that time. She was commissioned in October of 1941, and within weeks the country was at war, and she was needed, and so she was rushed through an abbreviated working up and sent to the Pacific to fight, with a crew that was still learning her. Many of her sailors were new to the Navy entirely, young men who had enlisted in the rush after Pearl Harbor and been trained fast and sent aboard, and they were learning their trade not in peacetime exercises, but in the middle of the most intense carrier war in history. On the job, under fire. The ship and her people grew up together, quickly, the hard way, and there was no margin for the ordinary process of becoming good at a difficult and dangerous job. They had to be good immediately because the enemy was already there. The men who made up that green crew came from everywhere, as the wartime Navy did. Farm boys and city boys from every corner of the country, most of them very young, 17 and 18 and 19 and 20, who had been in high school or working their first jobs a year or two before. A thin layer of career sailors and regular officers, the men who actually understood how a carrier worked, held the whole thing together and taught the flood of new hands on the job. And the job was being learned at sea, in a war, which is the hardest possible way to learn anything. A carrier is not a simple machine that a man masters in a week. It is thousands of interlocking tasks performed by hundreds of specialists who all have to function together with split-second timing. The flight deck crews and the engineers and the gunners and the aviators and the men in the magazines, and getting all of that to work as one takes time and repetition that the Hornet was never given. So, her people learned it the way you learn a dangerous trade with no time to spare, by doing it, by making mistakes and paying for them, by watching men get hurt and figuring out why until the ship worked. That she came together as well as she did, as fast as she did, is a real tribute to the men aboard her. But it was bought at a cost, in the ordinary accidents of a crew still learning a lethal machine. And it meant that these young men were carrying the heaviest possible load, the most intense carrier war in history, while they were still, in truth, finding their feet. And the job they were learning was among the most dangerous industrial work human beings have ever done, before anyone even started shooting. A fleet carrier is a floating airfield, and to understand what that meant for the men aboard, you have to understand what an airfield actually is when you put it on a ship. It is a place where aircraft are fueled and armed and launched and recovered, all day and often all night. And to do that, the ship carries within her hundreds of thousands of gallons of aviation gasoline and a magazine full of bombs and torpedoes and ammunition. The daily work of the ship was the handling of all of it, the pumping of the fuel, the hoisting of the bombs, the arming and fueling and moving of aircraft over and over in a confined space, in every kind of weather. A carrier was, in the most literal sense, a bomb that had been built to float and to sail, and everyone aboard her lived on top of that fact every hour of every day. And she was, on the inside, a vast steel labyrinth. Below the flight deck and the hangar, a carrier was a maze of hundreds of compartments on many levels, connected by steel ladders and hatches and long passageways, divided everywhere by watertight bulkheads and heavy doors that were dogged shut at sea, and a new man could wander lost for weeks before the geography of it settled into his head. Everything was steel, painted gray, hard-edged and often low. The overheads a tangle of pipes and cable runs and ventilation trunking, and men learned quickly to duck and to turn sideways, and which projecting fitting would open their scalp. It was loud everywhere with the constant background roar of a ship that never stopped working, the blowers and the pumps and the machinery, a noise so continuous that the crew stopped hearing it. And it was crowded everywhere, because a carrier's enormous interior volume was mostly given over to the hangar, the aviation fuel, the magazines, the aircraft, and the machinery, so that the 2,000 men who lived aboard were fitted into whatever was left in the gaps between the things the ship existed to carry. This was the environment the crew inhabited, not for a voyage but for the whole of a deployment, a hot, humming, crowded steel maze, lit around the clock by electric light, with the sea on the other side of the plating, and a hangar full of gasoline and bombs a few decks away. It took getting used to, and then it became the only world there was. The most dangerous place of all was the flight deck, and it was dangerous every single day, war or no war. Launching and recovering aircraft from a moving ship is one of the most hazardous routine operations there is, and in 1942 it was more so than it would ever be again, with heavier aircraft and weaker brakes, and none of the safety equipment that later generations would have. The men who worked the flight deck, the plane handlers the Navy called airedales, moved in a controlled frenzy as the ship turned into the wind, spotting the aircraft, ranging them for takeoff, and then, when a strike returned, recovering them one at a time, each landing a deliberate controlled crash onto a pitching deck, the plane snagging an arresting wire and slamming to a halt a few feet from the aircraft parked ahead. A snapped wire could cut a man in half. A plane that missed the wires and bounced over the crash barrier plowed into the aircraft parked forward and touched off a fire. A spinning propeller was invisible and lethal, and men were walked into propellers and the noise and the wind and the exhaustion. A plane going over the side took its crew with it. On a ship flying dozens of sorties a day, the accidents alone, with no enemy anywhere near, killed and maimed men steadily, and the flight deck earned its reputation as the most dangerous piece of real estate in the Navy. And that deck was worked by a whole world of specialists, each with a job that had to be done exactly right, at speed, in the noise and the wind. There were the plane handlers who spotted and moved the aircraft, muscling them into position by hand on a crowded pitching deck. There were the plane captains who tended each aircraft, checking it, fussing over it, keeping it flyable. There were the ordnance men who hung the bombs and the torpedoes and belted the ammunition, handling high explosive as a matter of routine. There were the fueling crews who pumped the aviation gasoline, thousands of gallons of the most flammable substance aboard. There were the men who worked the catapults and the arresting gear, the high-pressure machinery that flung aircraft into the air and dragged them to a halt, forces enormous enough to tear a man apart if anything failed. And over all of it, the men marked out by the colored jerseys that told each man's job. The whole intricate ballet of launching and recovering aircraft went on, dozens of times a day, in fair weather and foul, a controlled and constant emergency. It was skilled, punishing, dangerous work, and it never really stopped while the ship was at sea. And it was performed by young men who had, in many cases, learned it only weeks or months before. The flight deck of a carrier in action has been called the most dangerous 4 acres in the world, and the description was earned, and it was earned every day whether or not there was an enemy anywhere near, simply in the ordinary business of operating aircraft from a ship. Below the flight deck was the hangar deck, and there the great fear was fire. The Americans built their carriers with open hangar decks, the sides left partly open to the air, so that gasoline fumes could disperse and, if the worst happened, explosions could vent outward over the sea, and burning aircraft could be pushed over the side. It was a good design, and it would later save ships. But no design could change the basic fact that the hangar was where aircraft were parked, fueled and armed, packed close together, dripping gasoline, surrounded by bombs and ammunition. And a single spark in the wrong place could turn the whole cavernous space into a firestorm in seconds. The men who worked the hangar deck lived with that knowledge, and so did everyone below them, because a carrier that caught fire could become a horror faster than almost any other kind of ship, as the men of the Hornet would eventually see with their own eyes. And far below all of it, in the bottom of the ship, was the Black Gang, in the heat. Roughly a third of the crew were engineers, the men who ran the boilers and the turbines that drove the ship and made her power. And they worked in the engineering spaces deep in the hull, and in the tropical Pacific, those spaces were an oven. The fire rooms, where the oil-fired boilers made steam, ran well past 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and men stood 4-hour watches down there, in nothing but shorts and shoes, streaming sweat, drinking constantly, taking salt tablets to keep from collapsing. The noise was enormous and continuous, and they worked at the very bottom of the ship, below the waterline, with the longest climb of anyone to reach open air, in the spaces most vulnerable to torpedoes. And they knew it. And they went down the ladders, watch after watch anyway, because the ship could not move without them. Now the aircrew, because on a carrier, the aviators were a world of their own, and their day-to-day was its own particular strain. A carrier existed to fly its aircraft, and the men who flew them, the pilots and the gunners and the radio men, lived a life unlike anyone else aboard. They had status, the ready rooms, a certain glamour, and they also had a kind of daily fear that the ship's company did not, because it was they who had to fly off the deck and into the enemy, and they knew, with a precision the sailors did not, exactly how dangerous that was. Much of an aviator's day was waiting. He sat in the ready room in his flight gear, in the leather chairs, waiting for the order to man planes, and the waiting was its own ordeal, the not knowing, the tension of a mission that might come in an hour or might not come at all, the awareness that some of the men sitting in the room with him would not be sitting there that evening. Then the order would come, and they would go up to the flight deck and man their aircraft and be launched and fly out over the empty ocean toward a target that would be shooting at them and try to find their way back to a tiny moving deck in a vast sea, often low on fuel, sometimes shot up, sometimes wounded. The physical and mental fatigue of that, repeated, was immense, and it was laid on top of the ordinary discomforts of shipboard life that they shared with everyone else. There was a particular weight the aviators carried that no one else aboard did, and it lived in the ready room. That was where they gathered before a mission, and where they came back to after one, and both of those were hard in their own way. Before a strike there was the briefing and the waiting, the maps and the weather and the target, the long minutes in the leather chairs with your own thoughts, knowing that in an hour you would be flying into anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters, and that the odds, on some missions, were frankly bad. And after a strike, if you came back, there was the return to a room that was missing men, the empty chairs of the ones who had not made it, the plotting board that told the tally, the sudden gaps among the faces you had eaten breakfast with that morning. Carrier aviation in 1942 was brutally dangerous work, not only because of the enemy, but because of the flying itself, the deck landings, the long overwater navigation with no landmarks, the fuel that was always a worry, the weather. Men were lost to all of it, to the enemy and to the sea and to accident, and the aviators knew the numbers better than anyone, and they flew anyway, mission after mission, and then sat in the ready room afterward and looked at the empty chairs. It was a specific kind of strain, the strain of men who volunteered to go out into the danger over and over, and it was theirs alone among the crew, laid on top of everything else that everyone aboard endured. and the aircraft they flew in that first year of the war made the danger worse. The torpedo squadrons in particular still flew the Devastator, a torpedo bomber that had been modern a decade earlier and was now slow, underpowered, and desperately vulnerable. A machine that had to fly low and straight and steady toward its target for a long, exposed run in order to drop its torpedo, presenting itself to every gun the enemy had. The men who flew those aircraft knew exactly what they were flying, knew that it was outclassed, knew that going in against a defended fleet in it was very close to a death sentence, and they strapped into them and were launched off the Hornet's deck anyway, because that was the job, and those were the aircraft the Navy had. It is one thing to face danger in a weapon you trust. It is another to face it in one you know is not good enough, and to do it because there is no alternative, and that was the reality for the Hornet's torpedo flyers in the spring and summer of 1942. The courage it took was of a particularly clear-eyed kind, and the price of it, when the ship came to Midway, would be paid in full. Because for all its modernity, the Hornet was still a crowded steel box, and living aboard her was hard in all the ordinary ways. She had been designed for a crew of around 2,000, and with her air group and all the additional men the war required, she carried well over that. Better than 2,000 men packed into a hull that, for all its length, was mostly taken up by the hangar, the aviation fuel, the magazines, and the machinery, leaving the crew to be fitted into whatever space remained. They slept in berthing compartments crammed with bunks stacked several high, in the heat, with no privacy and little air. In the tropics, the interior of the ship was hot and close, and streaming with the humidity of 2,000 men breathing and sweating in a steel container. Fresh water was rationed, made in evaporators that never kept up, and men washed in salt water when they washed at all, and skin conditions and heat rash were universal. They ate in shifts in mess spaces that ran almost around the clock, and the whole thing smelled of gasoline and oil and steel and paint and men, the particular smell of a carrier that got into everything, and that the men stopped noticing after a week. And running under all of it was the watch bill and the loss of sleep. The ship ran around the clock, and so did her men in watches, typically 4 hours on and 8 off. But the hours off were never really off, because on top of the watches came the drills, the maintenance, and above all, general quarters, the call to battle stations, which could sound at any hour and did, over and over. In a combat zone, a carrier went to general quarters before dawn, and again at dusk, the 2 times an attack was most likely, and again whenever a contact appeared, and when it sounded every man ran to his station and stayed there until it was secured, which might be 20 minutes or might be most of a day. A crew that stands to battle stations before dawn and after dusk every day, and mans its watches around the clock in between, and tries to sleep in a hot, crowded compartment where a third of the ship is always awake and working, does not sleep the way human beings need to. The exhaustion accumulated across the weeks into a permanent gray fog that was simply the normal condition of being at sea in wartime, and the world these young men lived in was crushingly small, the same steel decks, the same 2,000 faces, the same ocean in every direction, for months on end. Mail came only when a ship happened to bring it, weeks apart, and a man might learn of a birth or a death long after the fact and have nowhere to be alone with it, because there was nowhere on the ship to be alone with anything. The routine was relentless, and the monotony pressed on the men in its own way, a grinding sameness broken only by the rare bursts of terror. Set the numbers down, because they show the scale of the machine these young men were living inside. The Hornet was about 825 feet long in the hull, with a flight deck running some 850 feet, and she displaced around 25,000 tons at full load. She was driven by 9 boilers producing 120,000 horsepower through 4 shafts, good for better than 32 knots. She carried in the neighborhood of 70 to 90 aircraft, and the fuel and ordnance to fly them, hundreds of thousands of gallons of aviation gasoline, and a magazine full of bombs and torpedoes. Her crew, ship's company, and air group together ran well over 2,000 men, something like 86 officers and 1,300 enlisted men to run the ship, and around 140 officers and 700 enlisted men in the air group. She was in commission for just over a year, from October of 1941 to October of 1942. In that single year, she fought in 3 of the most important operations of the Pacific War, and at the end of it, she was dead, and roughly 140 of her men were dead with her, and she was the last American fleet carrier ever lost in action. Those are the numbers, and every one of them describes the world these men lived in, and, for many of them, died in. It is worth dwelling a little longer on the plain physical misery of it, because that was the daily texture of life underneath the drama. The heat in the tropical Pacific was inescapable and constant. A steel ship under that sun becomes an oven, soaking up the heat by day and giving it back by night. And there was no air conditioning to speak of, only blowers pushing the same hot, wet air through the ducts, so that the berthing compartments and the mess decks and the working spaces were all hot, and men sweated day and night, and their bedding was damp and nothing ever dried. Fresh water was made in evaporators that never quite kept up with the thirst of 2,000 men, and it went to the boilers and the aircraft, and the cooking first and to washing last, so that showers were rationed hard, and men washed in salt water when they washed at all, and heat rash and skin infections were universal. The food was better than on a small ship, with the galleys and bakeries to do it, but feeding 2,000 men 3 times a day was an assembly line, eaten in shifts off steel trays, and the fresh stores gave way after the first stretch of an operation to the endless rotation of canned and dehydrated stores. None of this was dramatic, and none of it made the newsreels, and all of it pressed on the men every hour of every day. The heat and the damp and the rationed water and the monotonous food and the crowding and the noise. The slow grind of simply existing aboard a warship at sea for months, which wore a crew down as surely as combat did, only quieter. Now, the 3 things she did in her 1 year, because they are what the day-to-day was building toward, and the first of them is one of the most famous operations of the war. In the spring of 1942, with the country reeling and desperate to strike back at Japan somehow anyhow, a plan was hatched that was so audacious it seemed almost mad, to load Army medium bombers, B-25s, aircraft never designed to fly off a ship, onto the deck of a carrier, sail them within range of Japan, and launch them to bomb Tokyo itself. The carrier chosen to do it was the Hornet. In early April, she took 16 B-25s aboard at Alameda on San Francisco Bay. The big Army bombers lashed to her flight deck, far too large to strike below to the hangar, and she sailed west. And here is the thing about the day-to-day reality of that. With 16 Army bombers filling her flight deck, the Hornet could not operate her own aircraft. Her fighters and her scouts were struck below, useless, and she was, for the whole run toward Japan, a floating parking lot for someone else's airplanes, dependent for her protection entirely on the carrier Enterprise steaming with her. Her own crew did not even know at first where they were going. It was only once they were at sea that the ship's captain announced over the loudspeakers that the target was Tokyo, and a cheer went up, and then the reality settled in, that they were sailing a brand new carrier, unable to defend herself, deep into waters the enemy controlled. For the Hornet's crew, those 2 weeks were among the strangest of the whole war. They had 16 big Army bombers lashed down the length of their flight deck, aircraft they had never seen operate, crewed by Army flyers who were strangers aboard a Navy ship, and they had to live and work around them. The ship's own aircraft were struck below and could not be brought up, so the Hornet was, for the entire run, unable to defend herself, a fact her crew understood completely and could do nothing about. They watched the horizon and manned their guns and hoped the Enterprise, steaming with them, would be enough. And laced through it all was the secrecy, and then, once the target was announced, the sheer enormity of what they were doing, sailing a brand new carrier straight at the Japanese home islands, into the most dangerous waters on Earth, with 16 bombers on deck and no way to fight. The Army crews and the Navy crews got to know each other in those days. The flyers who were about to be launched on a mission, many of them might not survive, and the sailors who would launch them and then run for home. It was an odd, tense, historic interlude, and it ended in a rush on the morning of the 18th, when everything happened faster than anyone had planned. They were spotted before they wanted to be, and the whole thing nearly came apart. The plan had been to close to within a few hundred miles of Japan before launching, but on the morning of the 18th of April, a Japanese picket boat sighted the task force much farther out than intended, and the choice was stark. Launch the bombers immediately at extreme range, knowing many might not make it to safety in China, or turn back and abandon the whole operation. They launched. 16 Army bombers, one after another, roared down the pitching deck of the Hornet and clawed into the air, heavier than anything meant to fly off a carrier, and every one of them got off, and they flew on to bomb Tokyo and other cities, and then to crash land or bail out over China, most of the crews surviving, some not. The physical damage to Japan was slight. The effect on morale, American and Japanese both, was enormous, and the Hornet, having launched them, turned and ran for home at full speed, her job done, a brand new carrier that had just pulled off one of the boldest strokes of the war and had spent the whole of it unable to fight. It was an extraordinary beginning, and it was over, and almost immediately she was needed for something far larger. 6 weeks later came Midway, and Midway broke her air group's heart. At the Great Carrier Battle off Midway in early June of 1942, the Hornet was one of 3 American carriers that ambushed the Japanese fleet, and her aircraft flew off to attack. And what happened to them is one of the most terrible and consequential episodes of the entire war. Her torpedo squadron, Torpedo Squadron 8, flew low toward the Japanese carriers and their obsolete, slow Devastator torpedo planes, without fighter cover, and they were slaughtered. Every single one of the 15 aircraft was shot down. Of the 30 men who had flown off the Hornet in that squadron that morning, 29 were killed, and the rest of the Hornet's air group had a day almost as bad in a different way. Her dive bombers and fighters, sent off in the wrong direction by a navigational judgment that has been argued about ever since, never found the Japanese fleet at all, and flew on until they ran low on fuel, and some of the fighters ditched in the sea empty of gas, and some of the bombers landed on Midway, and some struggled back to the ship, and the great strike the Hornet had launched accomplished on that first terrible day, essentially nothing. Her men had flown off to win the battle and had instead been massacred or lost, and they knew it, and the ship carried that knowledge. And yet, the sacrifice of the torpedo planes had not been wasted, because in drawing the Japanese defenses down to the sea, they had helped clear the way for the dive bombers from the other carriers that, minutes later, destroyed the heart of the Japanese fleet. The Hornet's men had paid a fearful price, and it had counted, and that was cold comfort to a ship that had lost so many in a morning. It is worth pausing on those men, because they were not statistics. They were a squadron, a group of young men who had trained and flown and lived together aboard the Hornet, and their commander, a determined and experienced officer, had drilled them hard and believed in them fiercely. On the eve of the battle, he had written to them that if the worst came and only one plane was left, he wanted that plane to go in and get a hit. And they had gone into the battle knowing, better than anyone, that their slow, obsolete torpedo planes were flying into terrible odds. They went anyway, in tight formation, straight at the Japanese carriers, and they were shot down one after another, and the promise the squadron had made to itself, that they would press home the attack whatever it cost, was kept to the letter, because it cost them everything. The men in that squadron had been part of the daily life of the ship a few hours before, faces in the ready room and the mess and the berthing compartments, and by the middle of the morning they were nearly all gone, and the Hornet sailed on with their empty bunks and their empty chairs, and the war did not pause to let anyone grieve them. Then came the autumn and the Solomons, and the day her own turn finally came. Through the late summer and autumn of 1942, the Hornet was in the thick of the desperate fighting around Guadalcanal, and by October, with the other American carriers in the South Pacific sunk or knocked out of action by damage, she was, for a time, the only operational American carrier in the entire theater. A single ship carrying the whole burden, her crew worn down by months of it. And on the 26th of October, 1942, at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, the Japanese found her, and they came for her with everything they had. By that autumn, the crew were exhausted in a way that went beyond any single hard day. They had commissioned the ship in October of 1941, and had been driving hard ever since, the Doolittle Raid in April, Midway in June, and then months in the brutal grinding fight for Guadalcanal, operating almost continuously, with the terrible losses of the Solomons campaign mounting around them, and the other American carriers being sunk or knocked out one by one, until the Hornet was, for a stretch, the only one left in the theater. That meant no relief, no let-up, the same worn crew asked to be everywhere and do everything, standing the watches and flying the strikes and fighting the ship, day after day, for months, in the heat and the crowding, on too little sleep, under the constant threat of attack. The strain of that kind of sustained operation, quite apart from any particular battle, is enormous, and it accumulates. And by late October of 1942, the men of the Hornet had been carrying it for a long time. They were a veteran crew by then, hardened, competent, nothing like the green ship's company that had sailed a year before, but they were tired, deeply tired, and worn thin. And it was in that state, on the 26th of October, that they had to fight the hardest and last battle of the ship's life. What happened to the Hornet that day is the clearest possible picture of what the men aboard a carrier lived in fear of, and it happened fast. The morning began, as every day at sea in a combat zone began. With general quarters before dawn, the crew closed up at their stations, the aircraft launched to strike the enemy, and then the Japanese strike arrived over the Hornet, dive bombers and torpedo planes together, in a coordinated attack, and the ship's guns filled the sky, and the aircraft came down through it anyway. In the space of a few minutes, the Hornet was hit again and again. Bombs struck her flight deck and burst inside her. Torpedoes struck her hull and flooded her engineering spaces and knocked out her power. And then, in the thing that the men who survived it never forgot, 2 Japanese aircraft, already hit and doomed, deliberately flew themselves into the ship, one crashing into her island and down onto the flight deck, one striking her side, turning themselves into bombs aimed by a human will, months before the word kamikaze would become familiar. In minutes, the Hornet was ablaze, listing, her power gone, dead in the water, a burning wreck where a fighting carrier had been. For the men inside her, those minutes were the thing every carrier sailor had lived in fear of, made real. The bombs that burst inside the ship killed and maimed men at their stations and started fires that raced through the compartments. The torpedoes that struck below flooded the engineering spaces, and men in the black gang, in the heat and the dark, found the sea coming in on them, with the longest climb in the ship between them and the open air. The aircraft that crashed into her scattered burning gasoline, and the damage control parties went into it, into the smoke and the flame and the wreckage, dragging hoses, fighting the fires compartment by compartment, carrying out the wounded, doing the desperate work that was the only thing standing between the ship and total destruction. They fought her fires with the ship dead in the water, and listing, with more attacks coming in, with the gasoline and the ordnance that were always the carrier's hidden danger, now cooking in the heat of the fires around them. Some of them died doing it, overcome by smoke, caught by explosions, trapped in flooding compartments. It was precisely the nightmare that everyone aboard a carrier carried in the back of his mind every single day. The fire, the smoke, the ship turning against her own crew, and for the men of the Hornet on the 26th of October, it was no longer a fear, but the thing that was actually happening, all around them, in the ship they lived in. Then came the long, grim ordeal of trying to save her, and failing. With her engines dead, a cruiser took the Hornet under tow, trying to drag her out of danger, and the tow line was rigged, and the slow, painful haul began. But the Japanese were not finished, and more attacks came in, and more torpedoes and bombs struck her, and at last it became clear that she could not be saved, and the order was given to abandon ship. Her crew went over the side into the sea, the wounded lowered into boats and rafts, the men who could swim going into the water, and the destroyers moved in to pick them up. Hundreds and hundreds of men pulled from the sea. And then, because she could not be allowed to fall into Japanese hands, American destroyers were ordered to sink their own carrier, and they fired torpedoes into her, and hundreds of rounds of 5-inch shells, and still, stubbornly, the Hornet would not go down. She was still afloat, burning, when the approach of Japanese surface ships forced the American destroyers to give up and withdraw, leaving her there, and it was left to Japanese destroyers, arriving in the night, to finish her with their torpedoes. She sank in the early hours of the 27th of October, 1942, the last American fleet carrier lost in the war, and around 140 of her men had died in the day's fighting. She had been in commission for 1 year and 1 week. The men who went into the sea that day watched their ship die from the water, which is its own particular grief. To abandon ship is to leave the thing that has been your entire world, your home and your workplace and your protection, and to slide down a line or jump into the open ocean and swim away from her, and then to float there in your life jacket, in the swell, and watch her burn. The destroyers came in among the swimmers and the rafts and pulled them out. Hundreds and hundreds of oil-soaked men hauled up scrambling nets and over the sides, and the great majority of the Hornet's crew were saved this way, plucked from the sea by the smaller ships. But they had to watch, many of them, as their own navy then fired torpedoes and shells into the Hornet to try to sink her, and as she refused to go down, burning, and as the ships that had rescued them were finally forced to steam away and leave her there to the enemy. For a crew to be pulled alive from the water is a mercy, and most of them were. The loss of life at Santa Cruz, around 140 men, was small beside the thousands who might have died in a ship of that size. But the survivors carried the image of it with them, the sight of the Hornet dead and burning on the sea, the ship they had brought to life a year before and had lived aboard through the raid on Tokyo and the horror of Midway, going down at last in the dark of the Solomons. Step back, and the shape of the Hornet's life is unlike almost any other ship's, and it is the shape this whole account has described. She had no long career, no accumulation of battle stars over years, no old age. She had 1 year, one single furious year, and she crammed into it more history than most ships see in a lifetime. The raid on Tokyo, the turning point at Midway, the death struggle in the Solomons, and then she was gone, killed while she was still, by the standards of a warship, brand new, her crew still in some sense learning her when she went down. The men who served on her lived the whole compressed, violent story at close quarters, the daily grind of a dangerous ship overlaid with the most intense operations of the war, the exhaustion and the heat and the crowding and the gasoline, the flight deck that could kill you on an ordinary Tuesday, and the enemy that could kill you on an extraordinary one, and finally the fire and the abandoned ship and the long swim in the open sea. That was being on the Hornet. It was a year, and it was hell, and it ended with the ship on the bottom of the Pacific, where her wreck was finally found, decades later, more than 3 miles down. The men who survived her scattered, as the crews of lost ships did, reassigned to other ships and other duties, carrying the Hornet with them for the rest of their lives. A ship most of them had served in for less than a year, and would never forget. The Navy gave her name to a new carrier, a bigger one, almost at once, so that there would be a Hornet in the fleet again within a year, and that ship went on to a long and famous war of her own. But the first Hornet, the one that launched the Tokyo Raid and fought at Midway and died at Santa Cruz, lay lost and unvisited on the floor of the Pacific for more than 76 years, until an expedition searching the deep water off the Solomon Islands found her at last, sitting upright in the dark, 3 miles and more beneath the surface, a war grave for the men who had gone down with her. She had lived 1 year, and it had taken 3/4 of a century to find where she came to rest. One of the men who flew off her deck became the single most famous survivor of the whole Pacific War, and his life afterward is where this ends. His name was George Gay, and everyone called him Tex because he was from Waco, and he was a 25-year-old ensign, a torpedo pilot in Torpedo Squadron 8, the Hornet's torpedo squadron. On the morning of the 4th of June, 1942, at Midway, he flew off the Hornet's deck with his squadron, 15 aircraft, 30 men, to attack the Japanese fleet, and he was the only one of those 30 men who lived. His squadron went in low and slow and without fighter cover, and the Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire tore them to pieces, one after another. And George Gay watched the men he had trained and flown and lived with die around him in the air. He got his own torpedo away at a Japanese carrier, and then his aircraft was hit, and it caught fire, and he crashed into the sea, wounded in the arm and the hand and burned on the leg, his gunner dead. He pulled himself out of the sinking plane, and a black rubber seat cushion floated up out of the wreckage, and he grabbed it, and he hid beneath it, floating in the middle of the Japanese fleet, because a man's head is hard to see against the sea, and a life raft is not, and he had been told never to throw anything away. And from there, from the water, under the cushion, he watched the battle turn. He floated there, wounded, all through that day, and he had the most extraordinary vantage point of the entire war, because from the surface of the sea in the middle of the enemy fleet, He watched the American dive bombers come screaming down and destroy 3 Japanese aircraft carriers, one after another, the ships burning and exploding on the horizon, the turning point of the Pacific War unfolding around a single wounded man floating under a seat cushion. His own squadron had helped make that possible, and every one of them but him was dead. He spent about 30 hours in the water, alone, before a patrol plane spotted him the next afternoon and landed and pulled him out of the sea. He was, overnight, the most famous survivor in America, his face on the cover of Life magazine, the sole survivor of Torpedo 8, the man who had seen the whole thing. He carried that for the rest of his life, and he did not waste it. George Gay recovered from his wounds and went back to the war, flying again in the Pacific, and he survived it. And afterward he became an airline pilot, and he flew for the airlines for some 30 years, an ordinary working life at the controls of an airplane, the same hands that had flown the Devastator off the Hornet. But he never let the world forget the 29 men who had not come back, his squadron, and late in his life he wrote it all down, the whole of it, in a book, so that what those men had done and what it had cost would be on the record. He spent his last years speaking about them to anyone who would listen. An old man keeping faith with the boys he had flown off the Hornet with on a June morning in 1942. He died in October of 1994 at the age of 77, and he had left instructions for what was to happen to him afterward. His body was cremated, and his ashes were carried out to the coordinates in the middle of the Pacific where Torpedo Squadron 8 had gone down, to the patch of ocean where his 29 comrades still lay, and they were scattered there, on the wind, over the water, so that the sole survivor of Torpedo 8, 52 years later, could at last rejoin his squadron